I'm Jim Kircher, and we're going to start off with some old news. You know, accusations of voter fraud, an attempt to overturn an election, legislative and court battles. But in this case, it's really old news. In 1940, Missourians elected a Republican governor, but he wasn't sworn in on Inauguration Day. It was 80 years ago, and they called it the Great Governorship Steal. There are so many players in this story, it's hard to keep track since only a few names might be familiar today, and hardly anybody's around who was in on it. We did, however, find two people who have written about the attempt to steal the governorship. Retired UMSL professor Lana Stein wrote a book on the history of St. Louis politics.
It was just a different era.
And Bob Priddy spent 40 years covering Jeff City for Missouri Net. And he knew the story as part of Capitol history.
A case of where the Democrats were firmly in control of state government at the time, and they did not want to give up that control.
They succeeded in preventing the new governor from
taking
office.
for 40 days, yeah.
So before we get to the 1940 governor's race, some important background. We'll start with St. Louis Democratic Mayor Bernard "Barney" Dickmann. This is him unveiling a new fleet of streetcars in 1939. In his 2 terms, he'd done a lot. He'd built Homer G. Phillips Hospital, started clearing the riverfront for a new memorial, and tackled the city's smoke problem. He was powerful, but not as powerful as the guy on the other side of the state, Tom Pendergast, boss of the Democratic machine in Kansas City, and by extension, Jefferson City. In Pendergast's prime, people called the governor's mansion Uncle Tom's cabin. But by the late 1930s, that had changed.
By this time, Tom Pendergast had gone to prison. He was in trouble, and his machine out of Kansas City that had controlled Democratic politics for decades was pretty much falling apart. And Dickmann, the mayor of St. Louis, Bernard Dickmann, thought that his little machine in St. Louis could replace Pendergast as the political machine in Missouri.
He had wanted an ally in the governorship who would give them more patronage jobs in the state and see that New Deal monies got to the city. Dickmann wanted to be the supremo politician.
The man Dickmann wanted in the governor's mansion was City Excise Commissioner Larry McDaniel, who faced a Republican from Webster Groves, Forrest Donnell. And it was close. When the results came in, the Republican, Donnell, had won by fewer than 4,000 votes. And immediately, the Democrats charged voter fraud. A recount was demanded. McDaniel refused to concede.
But it was funny because I thought of it when we had the aftermath of this presidential election and whether there was fraud, et cetera. There always is some fraud, but not like there used to be, you know.
And some of these things that you hear from 1940 and 41 sound a lot like some of the things that we heard just last year.
And the evidence? Well, there must have been fraud because their guy lost. But the idea of a stolen election did not have popular support. This was pure power politics.
Oh, it very much was power politics because the Democrats really had Missouri in their grasp and they didn't want to let anybody have any part of it that wasn't a loyal Democrat. The story is that top Democrats held a meeting here in downtown St. Louis in what was then the DeSoto Hotel. It was behind closed doors, of course, and they devised a strategy to overturn the election and get McDaniel into office. And this is where we have to introduce another key player in all of this. In that meeting with Dickmann and other Democrats was the St. Louis City Democratic Chairman, Robert Hannigan.
What I heard about Dickmann was that he was more of a showman and that Hannigan was the brains in the operation.
This was the plan. An election became official when the Speaker of the House received the results and announced the winner. So the Democratic majority voted to block the announcement and set up a special committee to investigate the election returns. And it worked for a while. Inauguration Day came and went with no swearing in of the Republican governor. But all of the other Democratic officials were inaugurated on the traditional Inauguration Day.
Well, they were sitting on it basically and trying for ways to extend the situation so that they might prevail.
Reports said the Democrats wanted some ballots thrown out on technicalities, but as for actual fraud, if they had evidence, they didn't share it. Note the quotation marks in the Post-Dispatch headline. The outgoing Governor Lloyd Stark stayed on as caretaker governor, but he was not happy about it. He was a Democrat, but he was an anti-machine Democrat, and he tried to block the maneuvers. The state constitution said an election could be contested, but only after the apparent winner took office. So Governor-elect Donnell went to the Supreme Court, which unanimously ruled that the Speaker of the House did not have the power to reject the election results. The job was just announce them.
The Missouri Supreme Court in February, 6 weeks after the inauguration day, finally told the legislature, look, you've got to swear this guy in. And then once you swear him in, then you can have your election contest. And so they finally begrudgingly swore him in.
Forrest Donnell was inaugurated on February 26 of 1941, 44 days late. And it wasn't over. McDaniel still wouldn't concede and set the recount in motion, a recount that began to show McDaniel was losing by an even bigger margin. He finally gave it up. He said he'd been misinformed by exaggerated reports of fraud. That same month, Barney Dickmann, who set out to become the state's big boss, didn't even keep his own job.
Yeah, and this event then, which became known as the Governorship Steal, kind of backfired on Dickmann.
Oh, yes, it did. Yes, it did. And the Republican candidate for mayor in 1941 kept complaining about the Dickmann-Hannigan Pendergast machine, etc., and used that rather artfully to win.
The man who beat him, Mayor William D. Becker, died a few years later in a glider crash at Lambert Field, part of a wartime demonstration. Dickmann stuck around. He was the St. Louis postmaster when he stood with President Harry Truman at Union Station in 1948. He had a bridge named for him, but people kept calling it the Poplar Street Bridge. Governor Donnell later became Senator Donnell, served a term, returned to practice law in St. Louis, and died in 1980 at the age of 95. The outgoing governor, Lloyd Stark, he went home to Louisiana, Missouri to help run the family business, Stark Brothers Nursery. Boss Pendergast served his 15 months in prison and in ill health lived out of the public eye, dying in 1945. Larry McDaniel, who'd had a long political career in the city, died in 1948. After the governorship fiasco, he ended up taking a job as a parole officer. As for Robert Hannigan, an ally of Harry Truman, he went to Washington, served as Internal Revenue Service Commissioner, U.S. Postmaster General, and he was, for a time, part owner of the St. Louis Cardinals. But he really made history, again, behind the scenes, as chairman of the Democratic National Committee. It is said without Hannigan, there may well have been no President Harry Truman.
Hannigan gets a lot of the credit for getting Harry Truman on the ticket with Franklin Roosevelt in 1944.
And that's the story of Missouri's great governorship steal, actually an attempted theft. 80 years ago, mostly forgotten, but still a heck of a story.